Welcome back to Vietnamese Vixens. Today's story is different from what we usually share here. This isn't about a young guy in his 20s or 30s chasing romance and adventure in Southeast Asia. This is about a man who came to Vietnam at 62 years old, looking for something quieter, something sustainable. His name is Henrik. He's from Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and he's been living in Da Nang for 10 years now. He thought he'd found the perfect retirement, the kind of peaceful golden years that seemed impossible back home. But after a decade in Vietnam, his perspective has shifted in ways he never expected. This is his honest truth about what those 10 years really taught him, about loneliness, about connection, and about the lies we tell ourselves when we're desperate to feel alive again. If you're watching from somewhere in the world and you've ever thought about retiring abroad, or if you know someone who has, drop a comment and let us know where you're from. And if the story resonates with you, hit that like button and subscribe, because these are the real stories that nobody wants to talk about, but everyone needs to hear. My name is Henrik van der Berg, and I'm 72 years old now. I moved to Vietnam when I was 62, which feels like yesterday, and also like a completely different lifetime. I worked in logistics for 38 years in Rotterdam, managing shipping schedules and warehouse operations. It was stable, decent money, nothing glamorous. My wife Margaretha died of cancer when I was 59. We'd been married for 34 years. Our two kids were already grown and living their own lives by then. My daughter Emma was in Berlin with her family. My son Peter was in London working in finance. We talked maybe once a month, sometimes less. After Margaretha passed, the house felt enormous and empty. Every room echoed. I'd make coffee in the morning and realize I'd made enough for two out of habit. I tried to stay busy with work for a while, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. I retired at 61 and suddenly had nothing but time and a pension that was decent by Dutch standards, but not enough to live comfortably in Rotterdam, not with the cost of everything climbing year after year. I'd always been practical, maybe too practical. I started researching. Where could a single man stretch a pension? Where was it warm? Because I was tired of the Dutch winters, tired of the gray skies that pressed down on everything from October to April. I looked at Spain, Portugal, Thailand, the Philippines. Then I started reading about Vietnam, and something about it appealed to me. It wasn't just about Western men chasing young women, though that element existed, of course. But there seemed to be a genuine expat community of retirees, people who'd made real lives there. The cost of living was a fraction of what I was spending in Rotterdam. I could rent a good apartment for what I was paying in utilities back home. The food was supposed to be incredible. The people were friendly. It felt like possibility. I sold the house in Rotterdam. Emma was upset about that, said I was being impulsive, that I was running away. Maybe she was right. I arrived in Da Nang in March 10 years ago. I'd chosen Da Nang because it wasn't as chaotic as Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh City, but it wasn't a beach town full of drunk backpackers either. It felt like a real city where real Vietnamese people lived their lives, but with enough international presence that I wouldn't feel completely isolated. Those first few months were disorienting in ways I hadn't prepared for. The heat was oppressive. The noise was constant. Motorbikes everywhere, honking, weaving through traffic with a kind of organized chaos that made my logistics brain hurt. The language barrier was worse than I'd anticipated. I'd learned maybe 20 phrases before arriving, and quickly realized how useless that was for any real communication. I felt invisible most of the time, which was strange because I was clearly foreign, clearly visible, but also somehow not really seen as a person, just as another tall Western man wandering around. I found an apartment in An Thuong, near the beach, 3rd floor, 2 bedrooms, balcony with a partial ocean view. It cost me about $300 a month, including utilities. Back in Rotterdam, I'd been paying 1,500 euros just for rent. The math made sense even as the emotional reality felt shaky. I bought basic furniture, set up internet, tried to establish routines. I'd wake up early, go for walks along the beach, come back and make terrible coffee with a Vietnamese coffee filter I didn't really understand how to use properly. I'd read. I'd watched Dutch television on my laptop. The days stretched out endlessly. After a few weeks, I discovered the expat cafe scene. There was this place called Café Hollandia, run by a guy from Utrecht, and it became my regular spot. Every Wednesday morning there was an informal meetup of Western retirees, mostly men in their 60s and 70s, a few couples. We'd drink coffee and compare notes about visa runs, where to get Western groceries, which hospitals had English-speaking doctors, how to negotiate rent, the best money transfer services. It was practical information sharing, but also something else, a kind of mutual recognition. We were all here for our own reasons, but those reasons had common threads, pensions that went further, warmer weather, a sense that back home we become irrelevant, invisible in a different way. There was Frank from Australia, who'd been in Vietnam for 8 years, always talking about how he'd never go back to Melbourne, how Australia had become too expensive and too politically correct. There was Klaus from Germany, who'd lost his wife like me and said he just couldn't bear another winter in Hamburg. There was David from South Africa, who'd talk your ear off about how Vietnam reminded him of Cape Town in the 70s, whatever that meant. These became my social circle by default. We weren't really friends in any deep sense. We were companions in expatriation, united more by what we'd left behind than what we'd found. But underneath all the practical discussion and weather comparisons, there was this loneliness that nobody really acknowledged. We were all living in this bubble of affordability and tropical convenience, but we were also profoundly disconnected from everything around us. The Vietnamese people we interacted with were service providers mostly. The women who cleaned our apartments, the men who fixed our air conditioners, the staff at restaurants. Friendly, but transactional. I'd see Vietnamese families at the beach, multiple generations together, laughing and sharing food, and I'd feel this ache that I couldn't name. My kids were thousands of kilometers away. My grandchildren barely knew me. I was living in paradise on paper and feeling hollow. About 4 months after I arrived, I found this small foodie place, about 10 minutes from my apartment. It wasn't touristy, no English menu, plastic stools, locals only. I started going there for breakfast most mornings because the pho was incredible, and it cost maybe $1.50 for a huge bowl. There was this woman who worked there, maybe mid-30s, always moving quickly between tables, taking orders, bringing food, clearing dishes. Her name was Lynn. I learned that much from hearing other customers call to her. She had this energy that stood out, even in the constant motion of the restaurant. Efficient, but not cold. She'd smile when she brought your food, a real smile, not the automatic service smile. After a few weeks of me coming in regularly, she started recognizing me, would nod when I walked in, sometimes would bring me fun without me even ordering because she knew what I wanted. Small things, but they felt significant when most of your daily interactions are functionally mute. One morning, the place was almost empty, just me and an old Vietnamese man in the corner reading a newspaper. Lynn brought my pho, and instead of rushing off, she lingered for a moment, said something in Vietnamese, and gestured at the empty restaurant. I shrugged, smiled, said one of my 20 phrases, something like, "Not many people today." She laughed at my terrible pronunciation. Then she surprised me by saying in halting English, "You come every day, you like pho very much." Her English was basic but understandable. I felt this stupid rush of excitement just at being able to have a simple conversation. We talked for maybe 2 minutes. She asked where I was from. I said Netherlands, she'd never heard of it. I said Holland, and she nodded, seemed to know that. She said her name was Lynn and asked mine. Henrik was hard for her to pronounce, so it came out like hen-like, with the emphasis wrong. But I didn't correct her. It felt good to be called anything at all. After that, we'd exchange a few words whenever I came in. Nothing deep, just small talk. How was the weather? Was I enjoying Da Nang? Did I have family? Basic things. But it became the highlight of my mornings in a way that probably should have concerned me. I started thinking about what I'd say to her, rehearsing little conversations in my head. I told myself it was just nice to practice English with someone, that it was good to have a friendly face in my routine. But really, I just felt less invisible when she smiled at me. The other expats at Café Hollandia would talk about Vietnamese women in this way that made me uncomfortable. There was this underlying assumption that any Western man here past a certain age was either with a Vietnamese woman or looking for one. The dynamic was always described in transactional terms. They'd talk about their girlfriends with this knowing cynicism, joke about how much the relationship cost them per month, compare notes like they were discussing car leases. Some of them were open about it being purely financial arrangements. Others tried to dress it up as real relationships, while simultaneously making jokes that revealed they knew better. I found the whole thing distasteful, which probably makes me sound judgmental or naive. Maybe I was both. I didn't think of Lynn that way at all. She worked at a restaurant. She was polite and friendly. That was it. Except it wasn't just that, was it? I looked forward to seeing her too much. I found myself going to that few place even on days when I wasn't particularly hungry, just to have that small interaction. I started timing my arrivals for when the morning rush had died down. when she might have a moment to talk. I told myself this was just cultural integration, making local connections, improving my language skills through practice. The lies we tell ourselves are always the most convincing ones. One morning, about 6 months into my time in Da Nang, I arrived at the restaurant and Lynn wasn't there. Another woman I didn't recognize was working, older, less friendly. I ate my pho quickly and left feeling disappointed in a way that seemed disproportionate to the situation. She was back the next day, but she looked tired, stressed. When she brought my food, I asked if everything was okay. She hesitated, then sat down across from me for a moment, which she'd never done before. She told me her mother was sick, in the hospital. Money was a problem. The medical bills were more than her family could easily manage. Her English wasn't good enough to explain all the details, but I got the general picture. She seemed embarrassed to be telling me this, kept apologizing, said she didn't know why she was sharing her problems with a customer. I said it was okay, that I was sorry about her mother. She thanked me and went back to work. I sat there finishing my pho and thinking about what she'd said. I knew what was probably coming next, or at least I thought I did. She'd asked for money. This was how these things went, according to all the cautionary tales I'd heard at the expat cafe. Vietnamese woman befriends Western man, establishes trust, then comes the sob story, then comes the request for financial help. I felt cynical and sad thinking about it that way, like something potentially genuine was being poisoned before it even had a chance to develop. But I also felt something else, something I didn't want to examine too closely. I wanted to help, not because I was being manipulated, but because I had money sitting in my bank account doing nothing, and she was struggling with something real. Her mother was genuinely sick. The medical bills were genuinely expensive relative to what she earned. What did it matter to me to help with that? I came back the next morning, and when Lynn brought my pho, I pulled out an envelope I'd prepared. Inside was $500 in Vietnamese dong. I pushed it across the table and said quietly, "For your mother, for the hospital." Lynn stared at the envelope for a long moment without touching it. Then she looked at me with this expression I couldn't read, surprise maybe, gratitude, but also something else, something like resignation or sadness. She started to refuse, said she couldn't accept it, but I insisted. I said I wanted to help, that it was no problem for me, please take it. Finally she did, holding the envelope carefully, and her eyes were wet. She said thank you multiple times, said I was very kind, said she would pay me back. I told her not to worry about paying me back, just to take care of her mother. That moment, sitting in that cheap pho restaurant, with Lynn holding that envelope and looking at me like I'd done something genuinely meaningful, I felt something I hadn't felt since Margaretha died. I felt needed. I felt useful. I felt like I mattered to someone. And that feeling, that warm surge of purpose and connection, that was the moment the trap closed around me, even though I had no idea yet that it was a trap at all. I thought I was just helping someone. I thought maybe I'd found a real friendship, something authentic in this strange country where I'd been feeling so lost. I finished my pho chi and walked home along the beach feeling lighter than I had in years, thinking maybe this move to Vietnam was going to work out after all. Maybe I could be more than just another lonely old man spending his pension check. Lynn's mother recovered, which I was genuinely happy about. Lynn told me this a week after I'd given her the money, and she tried again to talk about paying me back. I waved it off. I meant what I'd said. It wasn't about the money. I had enough. What was $500 in the context of my monthly pension and my modest lifestyle? Nothing. But the gratitude in her eyes, the way she looked at me like I was someone who mattered, that was worth more than I wanted to admit to myself. Things shifted between us after that, subtly at first. She started sitting with me more often when the restaurant was quiet, asking about my life in the Netherlands, about my family, about why I'd come to Vietnam. I told her about Margaretha, about feeling lost after she died, about my kids being far away and busy with their own lives. She listened in a way that felt genuine. She told me about her own life, too. She was 34, had never been married, lived with her mother and her younger brother in a small house on the outskirts of Da Nang. Her father had died when she was young. She'd been working since she was 15 to help support the family. She'd had boyfriends, but nothing serious. She wanted to travel someday, but couldn't afford it. Her English was better than she let on initially, just needed practice and confidence. I started coming to the restaurant not just for breakfast, but sometimes for lunch or early dinner too. Lynn would take her breaks at my table. We'd talk about small things, big things, everything in between. She made me laugh, which I hadn't done much of in years. She had this way of teasing me gently about my terrible Vietnamese pronunciation, about how I ate phos wrong, about my insistence on wearing socks with sandals, which apparently was a hilarious Western old man thing. I didn't mind being teased. It felt affectionate, familiar. It felt like friendship. About 2 months after the hospital money situation, Lynn mentioned casually that the roof of her family's house was leaking badly. The rainy season was coming, and they were worried about water damage. Repairs would cost money they didn't have. She wasn't asking me for anything, just mentioning it in the course of conversation, but I heard myself offering to help before I'd really thought about it. She protested weakly. I insisted. We settled on me giving her $300 for the roof repairs. She hugged me, briefly, and I felt that same warm surge of being needed, being useful, being someone who could make a difference in someone's life. The other expats at Cafe Hollandia would have torn this apart if I'd told them about it, which is why I didn't. They'd have said I was being played, that this was textbook manipulation, that the sick mother and the leaking roof were probably fabrications, or at least exaggerations, designed to extract money from a lonely old foreign man. Maybe they would have been right, but I didn't want to hear it. I wanted to believe that what Lynn and I had was different, was real, was based on genuine connection, and not just economic disparity and opportunity. Over the next few months, our relationship deepened in ways that felt natural at the time, but looking back had this inevitable quality to them, like watching a slow-motion accident. Lynn started coming to my apartment sometimes after her shift at the restaurant. We'd sit on my balcony and drink tea and talk. She'd tell me about her day, about difficult customers, about her dreams of maybe opening her own small restaurant someday. I'd tell her about my life in Rotterdam, about the logistics business, about places I'd traveled for work. She was fascinated by Europe, had seen it only in movies and photographs. I showed her pictures on my laptop. She'd point at things and ask questions, and I'd explain as best I could. She started staying later and later. Eventually, she'd fall asleep on my couch, and I'd cover her with a blanket and let her sleep rather than wake her to send her home. Then she started staying overnight intentionally, sleeping in my guest bedroom. She said it was easier than going all the way back to her family's house late at night, that the motorbike ride was dangerous in the dark. This made sense to me. I told myself I was just being practical, providing a safe place for a friend. But there was something else happening underneath that I couldn't quite name. I liked having her there. I liked waking up and hearing someone else moving around in the apartment. I liked making breakfast for two. The loneliness that had been pressing down on me since Margaretha died, that had followed me from Rotterdam to Da Nang, it lifted when Lynn was around. The financial help became more regular, more integrated into the fabric of our relationship. Her younger brother needed money for technical school. Her mother needed new medication that wasn't covered by Vietnamese health insurance. There were always small emergencies, small needs. And I always helped because what else was I going to do with my pension? Sit alone in my apartment and let it accumulate in a bank account. I was 72 years old. When was I going to spend it if not now? And spending it on Lynn, on her family, on making their lives easier, that felt purposeful in a way that spending it on myself never did. Frank from the Wednesday Cafe meetup asked me once if I was seeing anyone. I said I had a friend, a Vietnamese friend. We spent time together. He got this knowing look on his face that irritated me. He said that was nice, that companionship was important. Then he made some joke about Vietnamese women being good at taking care of older Western men. I didn't laugh. I told him it wasn't like that. He shrugged and changed the subject, but I could tell he didn't believe me. Klaus was more direct. He'd seen me and Lynn together at a coffee shop one afternoon. The next Wednesday, he pulled me aside and said I should be careful, that these relationships always had a cost that went beyond money, that I shouldn't fool myself into thinking I was special. I was angry at that, told him he didn't know what he was talking about, that not every connection between a Western man and Vietnamese woman was transactional. He just nodded slowly, like he'd heard that before. From other men who'd said the same thing before, everything fell apart. But it was transactional, wasn't it? I just didn't want to see it. Lynn was affectionate with me, held my hand sometimes when we walked, kissed my cheek when she said goodbye, called me kind and generous and good. But there was always something slightly performative about it, something I noticed in peripheral vision but never looked at directly. She'd be warm and attentive right before mentioning some new financial need. She'd go quiet and distant if I suggested maybe we should slow down on the money help. Maybe her family needed to figure some things out on their own. And I'd cave immediately because I couldn't stand the distance. Couldn't stand feeling like I was being selfish or withholding when I had so much and she had so little. Over 3 years, I gave Lynn somewhere around $20,000, some of it in chunks for big expenses. The roof, her brother's school fees, a motorbike so she wouldn't have to take the bus to work. Some of it just regular monthly help, basically an allowance, though neither of us called it that. I told myself I was investing in someone's future, helping a friend achieve stability, doing something meaningful with money that would otherwise just sit unused. The mental gymnastics were impressive. I was a logistics manager. I understood supply chains and costs and resources. But I couldn't apply any of that practical thinking to my own situation because I didn't want to. I wanted to believe the story I was telling myself. I wanted to believe I'd found something real. She moved into my apartment eventually, not officially, but she was there more nights than not. We weren't sleeping together, not in any romantic or sexual sense. I was 72, she was 34, my body didn't work that way anymore, and even if it did, the idea felt wrong somehow. But we shared space, shared meals, shared daily life. She'd cook sometimes, Vietnamese food that was better than any restaurant. I'd help her with English, we'd watch movies together, she'd fall asleep with her head on my shoulder. To anyone looking from outside, it probably looked like a typical expat relationship. Older Western man with younger Vietnamese woman, the same dynamic playing out in apartments all over Southeast Asia. But from inside, it felt different, felt like companionship, like family, like something I desperately needed even if it came with an asterisk I refused to read. The cracks started showing in small ways I initially ignored. Lynn would disappear sometimes for a day or two without much explanation. Say she was with her family or had errands to run. She'd be vague about where she'd been. Her phone would ring and she'd step out onto the balcony to answer it, speaking in rapid Vietnamese I couldn't follow. She'd mention friends I'd never met, use male names casually in stories, and when I'd ask who they were, she'd wave it off as no one important. I told myself I was being paranoid, possessive, that she was entitled to her own life and her own privacy. We weren't married. We weren't even technically in a relationship, not really, even though we lived together and I supported her financially. What claim did I have on her time or attention beyond what she chose to give? But doubt crept in, slowly, like water seeping under a door. The other expat's warnings echoed in my head. Klaus saying I should be careful, Frank's knowing look. All the stories I'd heard over the years at Café Hollandia about men who'd been taken for everything they had, who'd built lives with Vietnamese women, only to discover those women had Vietnamese boyfriends, or even husbands the whole time, that the Western man was essentially a financial sponsor for someone else's actual relationship. I'd always thought those men were fools, that they'd ignored obvious signs, that I'd never let myself be used that way. But when you're in it, when you're the one desperate for connection and terrified of loneliness, the signs don't feel obvious at all. They feel like paranoia, like your own insecurity and jealousy, distorting innocent situations. The breaking point came in year 4. I'd been in Vietnam for almost 8 years at that point. I was 70 years old. My health was starting to decline, in small ways. Nothing catastrophic, but the accumulation of age. Joints that ached, stamina that wasn't what it used to be, the sense of time running out, becoming less abstract and more immediate. Lynn was still living with me most of the time, but she'd become more distant, less physically affectionate, spent more time on her phone, more time away. I'd asked her a few times if everything was okay, if she was happy, if there was something wrong. She'd always say everything was fine, she was just busy, just stressed, nothing to worry about. Then one afternoon, I was at a local market with Klaus, buying vegetables, and we ran into a Vietnamese friend of his, a woman named Thu, who spoke excellent English and knew a lot of the local expat community. We chatted for a few minutes, and then Thuy said something casually that made my blood go cold. She mentioned seeing Lynn the other day with her boyfriend Min, said they were shopping for furniture together, seemed very happy. She said this like it was common knowledge, like of course I knew about men. Why wouldn't I? I stood there holding a bag of mangoes and couldn't speak. Klaus noticed immediately, made some excuse to Thuy and steered me away. We sat at a nearby cafe and he ordered me coffee I didn't drink. I asked him if he knew, if everyone knew. He said he'd heard rumors but hadn't wanted to say anything because I'd been so defensive before, so insistent that my situation was different. He said Min was a local guy, around Lynn's age, that they'd been together for years apparently, that Lynn had never hidden it from her Vietnamese friends, but had hidden it from me because I was the one paying for everything. I felt sick. Not surprised exactly, because some part of me had known, had seen the signs, and chosen not to interpret them. But hearing it stated plainly, undeniably, from someone with no reason to lie, that collapsed all my careful denial. I'd been a wallet. a convenient foreign pension funding. Lynn's actual life was someone else. All the companionship, the affection, the shared meals and movie nights and conversations, all of it had been a performance, a transaction, payment for the money I provided. I confronted her that night. She came home around 8, and I was sitting on the couch waiting. I asked her directly about Min. She didn't deny it. She didn't even seem particularly upset at being caught. She just looked tired, almost relieved. She said yes, Min was her boyfriend. They'd been together for 6 years. He was a good man, but didn't have much money, worked as a motorbike mechanic. She said she cared about me too, that I'd been very kind to her, very generous, that she was grateful. But she said it like gratitude was something separate from affection, like I'd been a benefactor, not a companion. She said she'd never lied to me, that I'd never asked directly if she had a boyfriend, so she'd never had to lie, which was technically true, but felt like a devastating semantic game. I asked her if any of it had been real, our friendship, our time together. She said yes, of course, she enjoyed spending time with me. I was interesting and kind. But even as she said it, I could hear how it sounded. I was nice enough. I was useful. I was someone who'd improved her life materially, while demanding relatively little emotionally compared to a real relationship. I'd been exactly what Klaus had warned me about, and exactly what I'd sworn I'd never become. Just another lonely old foreign man who'd paid for companionship and convinced himself it was something else. She moved out that week. We didn't fight, didn't have a dramatic scene. She packed her things, thanked me again, said she hoped I'd be okay. I gave her 1 more month of money, which in retrospect was pathetic, like I couldn't help myself even after everything. She took it without comment. Then she was gone, and the apartment was empty and quiet in a way it hadn't been in years. I sat on my balcony that night and looked at the city lights and felt something much worse than anger or betrayal. I felt stupid. I felt like I'd wasted years and tens of thousands of dollars on a fantasy I'd known was a fantasy the entire time, but had participated in anyway because the alternative was admitting I was alone. That was 2 years ago. I'm 72 now, and I'm still in Da Nang. People ask me sometimes why I didn't leave after everything with Lynn, why I didn't go back to the Netherlands or move somewhere else, start fresh. The honest answer is, I don't know where else I'd go. Rotterdam doesn't feel like home anymore. My kids have their own lives. Emma in Berlin with her husband and 2 teenagers who barely know me. Peter in London working 80-hour weeks in finance. I see them maybe once every 18 months when I fly back for a visit that always feels slightly obligatory on both sides. Polite conversations over dinner where we run out of things to say after an hour. They're not bad people, my children. We're just not close. That ship sailed years ago, maybe when they were still young, and I was too focused on work. Maybe after their mother died, and I retreated into myself instead of leaning on them. Doesn't matter now. The distance is what it is. I still see Lynn occasionally, which probably sounds insane. Not regularly, maybe once every few months. We'll run into each other at a market or a cafe and exchange awkward pleasantries. She's still with men as far as I know. She looks happy, or at least content. I don't feel angry when I see her anymore, which surprised me. I thought I'd carry that anger for years, that sense of betrayal and humiliation, but it faded faster than I expected, replaced by something more complicated. She didn't really do anything wrong, not in any clear-cut moral sense. She never promised me a romantic relationship. She never claimed to love me. I built all of that in my own head, created a narrative that suited what I needed to believe, and she just went along with it because going along with it improved her life significantly. Can I really blame her for that? An older foreign man offers you money, offers you a comfortable place to stay, asks for nothing but companionship in return. Of course you're going to say yes. That's not manipulation. That's just pragmatism, survival economics in a country where the average monthly wage is a fraction of what I get in pension. The expat community here, the Wednesday morning cafe crowd, they mostly don't know what happened with Lynn. I stopped going to those meetups for about 6 months after she left. Couldn't stand the thought of facing Klaus and his knowing nods, Frank and his cynical jokes. When I finally went back, nobody asked directly where I'd been, which was a relief. Klaus caught my eye once and gave me this small, sad smile that said everything without words. We'd never talked about it. Some things don't need to be discussed. The community itself has changed over the years. Some of the original guys have died, which is the harsh reality of being a 70-something expat in a foreign country. Frank had a heart attack about a year ago, survived but went back to Australia to be near his daughter. Klaus is still here, but frailer. Uses a cane now, talks about his own mortality more openly. New retirees arrive regularly, younger than us, 60 or 65, still relatively healthy, full of that initial optimism about their Vietnam adventure. I see myself in them, and it's uncomfortable. That same naive confidence that they're different, that they've figured out something the rest of us missed. I don't try to warn them anymore. They wouldn't listen anyway, same as I wouldn't have listened. My health isn't what it was. Nothing catastrophic, just the slow decline that comes with being in your 70s. My knees hurt most mornings. I have blood pressure medication I take daily. My doctor back in Rotterdam, the one I still do video consultations with because I don't entirely trust Vietnamese healthcare for complex issues, keeps suggesting I should consider moving somewhere with better medical infrastructure, somewhere closer to family in case something serious happens. He's probably right, but I haven't acted on it. The inertia is powerful. I've built a life here, even if it's not the life I thought I was building. I have my routines. I know which pharmacy has my medications. I know which coffee shops have decent Wi-Fi. I know how to navigate the chaos of Da Nang traffic without getting killed. Starting over somewhere else at 72 feels impossible. I live more cheaply now than I did when Lynn was around. That was one clear benefit of her leaving, perverse as it sounds. I'm not spending money on her family's endless emergencies, not buying motorbikes or paying school fees or covering medical bills. My pension goes back to just supporting me, which means it goes much further. I could probably afford a nicer apartment, but I've stayed in the same place. It's familiar. The landlord knows me, doesn't raise my rent, fixes things promptly when they break. I don't need more space. More space would just mean more emptiness. I still go to the same farm place where I met Lynn, though she hasn't worked there in years. Different staff now. They don't know my order by heart, don't sit and chat with me. It's purely transactional, which is fine, which is actually appropriate. I eat my phu tea and read on my tablet and leave. Sometimes I think about those early months when Lynn would sit at my table during slow periods, and we'd struggle through conversations in broken English and even worse Vietnamese. And I feel this ache that's not quite regret and not quite nostalgia. More like mourning for the version of myself who still believed connection like that was possible, who still had enough hope to be disappointed. The loneliness now is different than it was before Lynn. It's cleaner somehow, more honest. I'm not pretending anymore. I'm not constructing elaborate justifications for why someone 38 years younger than me would want to spend time with me for reasons other than money. I know exactly what I am now. I'm a 72-year-old foreign man living alone in a country where I'll always be an outsider, where I'll never speak the language fluently, where I'll never fully understand the culture. I have acquaintances, but not friends, not really. I have routines, but not purpose. I have comfort, but not joy. And that's just the reality of the choice I made 10 years ago. Would I do it differently if I could go back? I don't know. That's the question people always ask, the story arc they want, the lesson learned. But I genuinely don't know. If I'd stayed in Rotterdam, I'd probably be just as lonely, just colder and poorer. At least here, the weather is warm, and I can afford to eat well. At least here I had those years with Lynn, whatever they actually were. They felt like something at the time. Maybe feeling like something matters even if it isn't real. Maybe the performance of connection is better than no connection at all. I don't know if I believe that, but I don't know if I don't believe it either. I think about Margaretha sometimes. Wonder what she'd think of how I've lived these 10 years since she died. She was always more practical than me, more clear-eyed about people and situations. She probably would have seen through Lynn immediately, would have told me I was being a fool, but she also would have understood the loneliness that drove it, because she understood me in ways nobody else ever has or probably ever will. Marriage at its best is that kind of deep knowing, and you don't get that twice in a lifetime. Everything after is just trying to fill the space where that knowing used to be. The other day I was walking along the Han River at sunset, which is something I do most evenings because it's beautiful and free and gives me somewhere to go. There was a Vietnamese family nearby, 3 generations, grandparents and parents, and 2 young kids, all sitting together on the grass eating snacks and laughing about something. The grandmother was probably around my age, maybe younger, hard to tell with Vietnamese people sometimes. But she was surrounded by family, by people who needed her and loved her and would take care of her as she got older. And I felt this sharp envy that surprised me with its intensity, not for Vietnam specifically, but for that kind of rootedness, that sense of belonging to people and place. I chose mobility over roots. I chose financial comfort over proximity to family. I chose the fantasy of reinvention over the reality of aging in place. And the consequence of those choices is that I'm here, alone, watching other people's families from the outside. That's not Vietnam's fault. That's not Lin's fault. That's just the arithmetic of the decisions I made. If someone asked me for advice about retiring in Vietnam, or anywhere in Southeast Asia, really, I wouldn't tell them not to do it. I wouldn't give them dire warnings about being scammed or used. What I'd tell them is simpler and harder than that. I'd tell them to be honest with themselves about what they're looking for and what they're likely to find. If you're coming here expecting to escape loneliness, you won't. You'll just relocate it. If you're coming here expecting younger women to genuinely want you for anything other than economic security, you're delusional. That doesn't mean relationships can't form, can't have real affection and companionship embedded in them. But know what the foundation is. Know what you're paying for, and be at peace with it. Don't lie to yourself the way I did. The costs of living here aren't just financial, though those add up faster than you think once you start helping people. The costs are also about identity, about admitting what you are and aren't. You're a foreigner with money in a place where most people don't have money. That defines every interaction, whether you want it to or not. You can be kind, you can be generous, you can be genuine in your affection for people and places here, but you can't escape the fundamental dynamic of inequality that shapes everything. And if you can't live with that, if you need to believe you're relating to people as equals, you're going to end up hurt and bitter. I'm not bitter, though, which might be the strangest part. 1,000 sad sometimes, lonely most of the time, but not bitter. I got something out of those years with Lin, even if it wasn't what I thought I was getting. I felt needed. I felt useful. For a while, I felt less alone, even if that feeling was built on a misunderstanding. And Vietnam itself, apart from any personal relationships, Vietnam gave me 10 years of warmth and affordability, and the dignity of being able to live independently on my pension. That's worth something. That's worth a lot, actually. I'm still here. Still in the same apartment in An Thuong, still walking the same streets, still eating phia at the same places. My life has gotten smaller, more solitary, more stripped down to essentials. I read a lot. I watched the ocean. I video call with my kids once a month and pretend we're closer than we are. I manage my medications and my money and my expectations. I exist here in this strange liminal space between cultures. Not Vietnamese, no longer really Dutch, just an old man passing time in a place that's beautiful and foreign and ultimately indifferent to me. 10 years feels like both forever and no time at all. I'm not sure what the next 10 years will look like, or if I'll have 10 more years. Probably I'll get sicker, need more care, eventually have to make decisions about whether to go back to Europe to die near family or die here in this apartment with strangers handling the logistics. Cheerful thoughts for an old man watching the sunset. But these are the thoughts you have when you're 72, and alone, and living somewhere you don't quite belong. I don't regret coming to Vietnam. I don't regret the years with Lin, even though they cost me more than money. What I regret is believing I could outsmart loneliness through geography and financial leverage. You can't. Loneliness isn't a problem you solve by moving or spending or finding the right person to share space with. It's something deeper, something about being human and mortal and separate from everyone else, no matter how close they seem. Vietnam didn't teach me that. Lin didn't teach me that. I just finally stopped running from it long enough to see it clearly. The sun is setting over the Han River again tonight. Same river, same city, same old foreign man watching it happen. 10 years in Vietnam, and this is my honest truth. It didn't save me, but nothing else would have either. At least here the FAPA is good, and I can afford it.